Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Jonathan Astro. Back in June 2022, we spoke to political sociologist Salvatore Babones about the state of Australian universities, how they're funded, and more broadly, what function a university serves in the 21st century. Hint, not much.
The teaching is woefully underemphasized at Australian universities, which almost seem to promote bad teaching. And I think a lot of the reason for that is there's very little accountability for teaching. In the US, there's a very strong emphasis on teaching quality, which is not to say that all teachers are good. It's to say that the minimum standards that are acceptable are much higher than the minimum standards in Australia. Chalk and talk, as we call it, just going to the board or going to PowerPoint and talking over your slides is so embedded as the default mechanism. In the US, if you simply read off your lecture slides, you can probably get away with it if you already have tenure. But if you're a new professor, you would be strongly discouraged from that.
Welcome to the New Flesh Podcast, the podcast you deserve. My name is Ricky Orpike, and I'm joined by Jonathan Astro. Now, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, Ricky. Did you go to university?
I did.
You did?
Just a little bit.
Just spend a bit of cash, did you?
Well, actually, a lot, yes.
Okay, well, I would encourage you not to listen to today's podcast because this is going to, you're going to learn about the university system from Salvatore Babones. And
well, I
don't
don't
know.
think I can get out of it. Like, I'm part of the show. Like,
Yeah, right. Okay, that's
I
not
don't think
going
that's
to
going to
work.
work.
Well, anyway, look, just block your ears and ask your questions if you must. Let's do it.
Salvatore Babones is a political sociologist at the University of Sydney and an elected member of the National Committee on US-China Relations. His book, The New Authoritarianism, Trump, Populism and the Tyranny of Experts, was named Best on Politics in 2018 by the Wall Street Journal. He has written dozens of academic papers and has also penned op-eds for The Australian, The Sydney Morning Herald, The Australian Financial Review, Spectator Australia, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs and The National Interest. He is also the regular host of the live stream show On Liberty for the Centre for Independent Studies. His most recent book is Australia's Universities, Can They Reform? Salvatore, welcome to the New Flesh.
Great to be here.
Okay, so when I was stalking you online, I came across your Twitter page and there was a pinned tweet explaining that you had left the platform due to some censorship that we may have seen in the past, but it seems you're back. So would you mind telling us why you left and what made you return?
I came back with a thank you, Elon tweet. I left after the January 6th, post-January 6th, 2021 repression in the United States. I think that was way out of line and way overboard. In fact, I'm writing a book about it. So take a look in 2023. But I really don't think that it's the role of technology platforms to be deciding what people can hear. And I think Twitter went way overboard. Other platforms did as well, but Twitter especially. And so I got off Twitter until they come back with a more open approach to political speech.
Well, what do you make of the reactions we've seen to Elon Musk's potential buyout of Twitter from the politicians, the media, and other establishment figures? Because the way they're talking is it's as though, and I hate to say it, it's as though Hitler has just taken over.
It has exposed an alarming willingness to repress others. And I think that is very anti-democratic. And speaking as an American, I think it is fundamentally un-American. But many people profess to believe in democracy, but only believe in it when it gives them the results they want.
So why are establishment figures so obsessed with misinformation and disinformation, as we've seen, and we've seen the new Ministry of Truth being set up as well? So why is it their business if I want to believe in lizard people or the Great Reset? Having weird beliefs used to be kooky and charming. Now it seems to be criminal.
Well, and let's not forget malinformation, which is one they haven't been using much lately. But Jen Psaki did like that trio before she got a lot of criticism for it. Look, the American political establishment and political establishments globally have been alarmed by the rise of populism. Now, I think they've caused the rise of populism. Populism is something that breaks out when the organized political establishment does not want to accommodate the views of people. It doesn't find a place for them. And when the establishment can't find a place for dissent, it breaks out into a kind of inchoate, leaderless anger against the establishment. So I'm not surprised at all that the American political establishment and other establishments around the world are now very worried about losing their monopoly on the public sphere, but they're going to lose it. And if they don't open up Twitter to allow it there, it'll go somewhere else. Populism is not an organized political movement advocating for any particular policy. Just looking at my own country in the US, we had Bernie Sanders progressive populism and Donald Trump conservative populism. Which one is the real? Will the real populism please stand up? Both are simply expressions of discontent with the options being offered to them by the political establishment. And when the political establishment goes back to creating space for dissent and creating representation for people's views, those movements will very quickly disintegrate.
Well, before we park populism for a little bit, I have just heard that Musk would let President Trump back on Twitter. What's your take on this?
Oh, fantastic. He should never have been kicked off in the first place. I mean, in a world where you can directly advocate violence on Twitter, where terrorists can be on Twitter, the idea that, well, because the former president of the United States is somehow vaguely disreputable, he should not be allowed on Twitter is just ridiculous. And I don't know if Donald Trump will come back on Twitter, but hopefully he will. And certainly Twitter would be a better place for having Trump on it.
Well, he has his own platform now, doesn't he? What's it called again, John?
He has his amusing own platform. I don't think anyone takes that seriously. I'm not even sure he does.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to the return of the Donald. I kind of miss him. So perhaps we'll turn our attention to the university system and the subject of your latest book, Australia's Universities, Can They Reform? Now, I don't think I've ever read in a single document a breakdown of the Australian university system as you have done in this book. So, and which I think would be, Ricky and I have done a bit of tertiary education, maybe more than we should have.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a book that perhaps we could have read at the beginning of all of that. Would have been nice. But so let's start at the beginning and step through we really want to step through the basics, because I don't think no one asks these questions. So let's start with the big ones. What is a university, and what is the point of a university?
Well, let me start by saying about the book. I wrote the book because I was really tired of seeing all the critics of universities focusing on, things were so much better back in my day. Students these days don't study. Administrators these days are just quashing free speech. There's no way you can say what you want at a university. All these kind of, if you'll forgive me, very petulant old man approaches to university reform. And what I wanted to do was something different, something very data-driven. The book has 23 tables and figures, tons of detailed data about the finance and character of the university system. It is not in any way a polemic. It's a serious social science approach to how our universities in Australia are managed. What is a university? Well, I mean, quite simply, a university is an institution that's the heir to 800 years of development, first in Western Europe, ultimately spreading to the entire world. And it's how we do post-high school education. It's that simple. Now, I do think that the core of the university is doing undergraduate education. But if you were to talk to university administrators today, you'd get a very different picture. They would say that a university does three things: teaching, research, and service. And they would like to unpack those three things, have a dedicated teaching arm of non-researchers, have a dedicated research arm, and have some little appendage that they can hire a small number of people and say that these people are doing some kind of service to the community. I don't think that works. I don't think that's the traditional model of what a university was, and I don't think it's a sustainable model for what the university should be in the future.
Well, I'm curious to know how do universities get their money, and what do they spend it on? It can't just be student fees, right?
In Australia, universities get their money from the Commonwealth. It's really that simple. Of course, students can pay for their education up front. They would be unwise to do so, given financially unwise, I mean, given the extraordinarily generous financing terms offered by the Australian government.
I've met people who have done that, and I must say, having internally felt a little unimpressed with them. I'm like, oh, why would you pay up
It's
front? Like,
financially unwise because if you have that money to pay up front, you'd be better off investing that money in the stock market, taking the low interest government loan and financing your future retirement out of it. There's really no reason to pay up front in Australia. The government finance program for students, HEX Help, is essentially a tax, a zero interest loan that is fundamentally a tax on university graduates who earn high incomes. People say that, they have to do vocational studies because if they don't, they could never pay back their loans. Well, that may be true in America, but that's not true in Australia. In Australia, if you become a starving artist, you'll never make enough money to pay back your student loan debt. And that's fine, right? You live your whole life at a low income, you'll never pay the student loan. So it's not really a loan, it's really a graduate tax. Now, universities, of course, have developed a substantial second stream of income, and that is international students. It's cash-paying international students. The third stream, which is Commonwealth research grants, were historically, and I think still are in a legal sense, tied to teaching. The Commonwealth has a roughly $1 billion annual research grant, block grant, that it gives to universities, and there are also grants through the ARC and grants for postgraduate research students. All told, the Australian government pays something like roughly $2 billion a year for research at universities. And the whole purpose of that $2 billion, when it was created, was to to support teachers in doing research. So the first Commonwealth grant funding for research was because science teachers needed laboratory spaces. And then, of course, humanities scholars said, well, we need libraries. These were not direct teaching expenses, but nonetheless necessary in order to have a model where research active people taught students. So originally, and in my book, I explicitly tie it, the Commonwealth research funding was geared towards the education of Australian students. And even today, it's not explicitly tied to education, but implicitly it is, because only institutions that teach undergraduate Australian students have access to the research grants.
Let's drill down into these terms, though. So, because this is a term that I had to read a whole book on, the craft of research. But when I was doing my work, that I'd never really thought about this word before. What is research, and how is it different from scholarship?
Well, there are formal definitions of these. The answer is that historically these words have been used interchangeably. But the scientists as a class have appropriated the term research, and through OECD mechanisms, something called the Frascati Manual, have formalized a definition of research that's very much centered on science understandings, big science understandings of what research is. That is, research must be budgeted, it must create new human knowledge, it must be explicit. That is, you must have a set of explicit goals and hypotheses that you are testing. In fact, when they finally added the language, instead of scientific research, the OECD started saying science, social science, and humanities research. They gave one explicit example of what research might be in history. Their example was an historian might try to create an historical timeline of paleoclimate data based on historical records. And that was their model for what kind of research you could do in history. Now, what all of us in the humanities and social sciences do has been technically relegated to this category, scholarship, which has a lower prestige. The implication is that scholars merely reorganize knowledge that already exists. So, for example, if an historian, if there is already the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle written in the Middle Ages, and an historian does work on the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, its authorship, and the implications for European history of the events recorded in it, well, all you're really doing is reorganizing existing knowledge.
It's essentially musical chairs.
Yeah, you're changing the chairs on the humanities Titanic, and of course that's ridiculous. But in the Frascati Manual, I do no research. I've published dozens of papers in research journals. I write books. I every year have to give a record to the university of a list of research publications. But because my research is not explicitly funded, not explicitly budgeted as research, because I don't have a timeline of when certain deliverables will be due and how they'll be done. My work is not technically under the Frascati manual research.
But I'm fascinated by this because why aren't some of the more left leaning of our kind who perhaps are writing papers about how William Shakespeare is a racist, and I don't know, like a bell hooks sort of reading of whatever, how come they're not more disappointed that they don't have the prestige? Like if you're a full cultural Marxist, shouldn't they, like, I love the idea that even if you're like more of a classic sort of thing, or you're them, we're both sort of being devalued. Shouldn't they be more hopped up about this?
I think they are, not think, I know they are unaware that they have been put in this category. Now, we're all vaguely aware of the prestige of big science, that universities want to fund big science. Of all the 50 or so major research initiatives from Australian universities, at the group of 8 universities, the group of 8, research intensive universities, not a single one is an unambiguously humanities oriented major research initiative. They're all science and a few token social science projects. But the big money goes into, the quantum computing and the telescopes and the big science efforts. And well, it should. The big money should go there. But we're very aware that the big money goes to big science. What we're unaware of is that in the minutiae of the reporting systems, what we do is not technically being counted as research, and we're unaware of it because we file research outputs with TEXA, with our universities, and through that to the Tertiary Education Quality Standards Administration. But we don't count. And I think in the long run, that's a real threat to all of us in the humanities and social sciences, because as things become formalized, as systems increasingly come under scrutiny, they'll find that we're not doing research. And if we're not doing research, why should we get 40% of our time for research? Most of us are workloaded 40-40-20 research teaching service.
Yes, well, I remember this must have been maybe last year, the year before. I think the federal government was talking about making fees higher for humanities subjects and making them cheaper to sort of push people more into STEM and that sort of thing.
They did. That was Dan Tehan's Job Ready Graduates package. Yeah, that went through.
Do universities care much about the humanities? I mean, it seems like all the fundings, comes through the hard sciences, and you see, politicians sort of pushing more for students to go through the hard sciences. So what's your take on that?
The humanities are disappearing in Australia as in the rest of the world. We don't so much notice it disappearing because so far there have been very few job losses. Instead, what's happening is that job expansion is occurring elsewhere. And so it's a slow, kind of lingering death on the vine instead of a grim reaper coming and cutting us all down. That may still happen. Some universities have eliminated departments, but in general, we're just being allowed to slowly shrink through attrition. And that's not just in Australia. In the US, it's been the same thing. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which has had very famous history and linguistics and other humanities departments, simply has become an all-engineering school. Now, of course, it was always primarily engineering, but I think if I remember the statistics right, there were something like fewer than 20 humanities majors at the whole university. And that's a change, right? These departments, which had previously been very high prestige, you have the Noam Chomsky's at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he won't be replaced. And that's really what's going on, is that we are just being allowed to disintegrate. I mean, today in Australia, there are very few robust humanities departments outside the group of 8. And even in the group of 8, not all of the group of 8 have a department of history, have a department of English literature. You would think every university would have these things. But in fact, if you look carefully, you'll see that what was previously a history department and an English department is now an amalgamated service department called Culture and Thought.
Yes,
Right.
They seem to lump in literature, and with it, they're trying to just bolt it on to something else, as an appendage. And I just am so obviously I've got a romantic view of the humanities. I want it to be the School of Athens, that painting. Like I obviously. So it's really I find it, and it's worse in Australia as well. I mean, you must know this because you've got the two perspectives, but our anti-intellectualism here, and it's an aggressive anti-intellectualism, and the people sort of get, if you talk about books or if you talk about like anything from that could be classed as coming from the humanities, even history, people get angry. They're not like even dismissive. They're dismissive at first and angry at worst. Do you know what I mean? Like that you're even talking about it, and the way that, just to put a bow on, I want to get your perspective on this. My experience has been that even younger people who are coming out of high school, they say stuff like, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to read this or that? Like, it's got nothing to do with my life. I don't care about it. And you just go, well, has no one ever told you that having a perspective from these works of history or literature or whatever might make you a better business person or whatever? I mean, is any of this resonating with you, Salvatore?
Well, I encourage everyone to get on YouTube and take a look at the Monty Python University of Wollongong Philosophy Department skit. So the idea that Australia is anti-intellectual is one of long standing, but I don't think there's much truth to it. The whole world is anti-intellectual. The question is simply, what do we make students do? In the US, everyone has to do a bit of humanities and a bit of science. I mean, it's usually required at universities that students do mathematics, at least through algebra, at most US universities. And humanities students in Australia would feel oppressed. They'd be protesting if they were forced to do a little bit of algebra. So the idea that you should be broadly educated, liberally educated, I might say, is one of very long-standing. It's one I genuinely believe in, but it cuts both ways. It means making. I mean, the real future for the humanities is that engineering and business students should still be doing some humanities. And the problem is that neither side wants that. The engineers don't want to waste a year of their curriculum on humanities and social sciences. But my experience of humanities and social sciences colleagues is they only want to teach people who are going to go on towards a PhD in their field. And they don't want to teach the great unwashed of nursing, social work, business, engineering, science students. And that's a recipe for irrelevance. I think there's a lot of selfishness among academics, well, among everybody, but especially among academics. And as long as their job is secure, they're not really thinking about the health of the discipline and the health of the university in general. There's a lot of self-indulgence. And that's not just among my individual colleagues. My book focuses a lot on the self-indulgence of university academics. I'm sorry to kind of broaden your question out to the whole universe, but academic self-indulgence through a lack of oversight is rampant. And it's very self-destructive, not for us as individuals, but it's self-destructive for, well, the idea of the humanities having a future, for example.
Well, let's get a little bit more specific and talk about Australian universities here. Can you give us a bit of an insider's view on the quality of Australian universities, like overall in terms of teaching, research, facilities, philosophy? Like where does Australia sit?
The research is as good as anywhere. It's world class. The teaching is horrible. The teaching is woefully underemphasized at Australian universities, which almost seem to promote bad teaching. And I think a lot of the reason for that is there's very little accountability for teaching. In the US, and I've had experience not just I did my PhD at Johns Hopkins, it's a very elite university, but I also taught for 5 years at the University of Pittsburgh, which is, a working class state university. So I've had experience of both. And in the US, there's a very strong emphasis on teaching quality, which is not to say that all teachers are good. It's to say that the minimum standards that are acceptable are much higher than the minimum standards in Australia. I've had to reduce the quality of my teaching simply to comply with the administrative environment of teaching at an Australian university, because the rules are so chalk and talk, as we call it. Just going to the board or going to PowerPoint and talking over your slides is so embedded as the default mechanism here that it is difficult to do anything more creative. In the US, if you simply read off your lecture slides, you can probably get away with it if you already have tenure. But if you're a new professor, you would be strongly discouraged from that. To give you this, the simplest, most straightforward, one cut says it all. In the U.S., I had a peer teaching observation every year with written feedback from one of my peers who attended my class. In 14 years in Australia, no one has ever attended any of my classes. I mean, that goes for students as well as well, my colleagues. But that's the other thing. In the U.S., I taught a 200 student big lecture where I could not take attendance, but I counted every day, day, and I found about 85% attendance. I walked into my first big lecture in Sydney, and I walked in mid-semester because calendars differed, and I picked up the class halfway through. And I walked into a 500 student lecture hall that was supposed to have 499 students in it, and there were maybe 12 or 15 scattered in this huge hall. And I said, "Where?" I thought I was in the wrong room. I said, "Where is everyone?" And it's like, "Well, lecture's not required." It's just the attitude. I had a student literally yesterday. He kept showing up to tutorial without coming to lecture. And I told him, well, I really ask the students come to lecture before that, because my tutorial was immediately after the lecture. So I could see students, who were appearing. And he said, "Oh, I'm confused. Which one is important? Is lecture?" He actually asked me, "Is lecture important for this class?" And I said, "Well, of course, lecture is important for this class. I mean, why do I do it?" But that attitude is so deeply ingrained that it's difficult to get away from. Look, I'll just give you one more anecdote. I assign readings. In the U.S., of course, many students didn't do the readings, and they would be embarrassed, red-faced, and apologize. In Australia, no one does the readings, and they just shrug their shoulders. So of course I don't have to do the readings. I don't want to somehow brag that U.S. students are so much better. They're not. They also don't do their readings. But at least there's a norm. At least they understand that by not doing their readings, they're breaking some norm, that they are not delivering on a responsibility they have. Here, there's just no sense of that.
Well, we're with you, Salvatore. Like Ricky's got endless experience teaching at the university level, and you were just complaining about that last night about again this aggressive laziness, which
But I
is
don't
probably
blame
what I
the
was getting at
students.
before.
It's the environment they've been placed in. When I taught introduction to sociology, when I took on my own big 1,000 student intro class, I relentlessly pushed attendance. And I was able to get attendance up to a level of about 75 to 80% for the first semester. But eventually these new students who, first time at university, first year students, they realize that no one else is going to any classes. They don't have to go to their other classes. And second semester, everything kind of dropped off. And by second half of second semester, I couldn't get anyone into the room because the norm is not being emphasized across the entire university, because my colleagues don't think that it matters. And I mean, it's very striking in the U.S. When I taught an intro class, it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 1 hour a day. Here, when I teach an intro class, it's 2 hours, one sitting. Well, that just shows you the same class, same number of credit points, but I have to work much harder for my teaching bread in the U.S. than I have ever had to work in Australia.
I had one. I went back to study not too long ago. Study a humanities degree, and there was one tutor who was incredible. She taught literatures of war, and she's American actually, and quite respected. And on the first day, she said, "We take things really seriously here. You have to read a book a week, and that's what we're doing. So if you don't like that, then you're more than welcome to not come next week." She was really hard on it, and it was like old fashioned. Like we were dead quiet the whole semester. It was one of the most transformative experiences I'd had. It was the greatest unit I'd ever done, and I mentioned her teaching style to one of the other tutors because I knew them and stuff, and they were like rolling their eyes, and they were as you say, they were sneering at this, and I found that indicative of the difference.
Yeah. Very much so. I've tried it, but I've been savaged on the student evaluations when I've tried it.
Sorry to jump in here, but my experience is that if you want to be that way and you want to try and lift standards, that you get a lot of pushback from the students, and then that flows through to the administration, and then that comes back to you as being, you're being too hard on the students. You can't ask this of them. You can't insist that they come. All of that sort of stuff. Like, how do you change the culture?
I don't change the culture. We change the culture, and it has to start at the top. It has to start with vice chancellors saying that teaching's important, that minimum standards will be applied in teaching. When vice chancellors want to do something about teaching, they generally have a teaching award. You find one good teacher, right, who you reward and applaud. It's much more important to bring up the bottom, to get all teachers meeting certain minimum requirements. I mean, to begin with, showing up. Right. I mean, that's the number one thing. Are you there on time and you teach the whole class? Well, if you could just get that, you'd be really improving Australian universities. But beyond showing up, vice chancellors have to make researchers teach. So a big problem is a lot of the high productivity researchers who've been recruited to Australian universities are recruited into research-only positions. So while in the US, the whole point of having a Nobel Prize winner in the US is to attract students. You have this Nobel Prize winner teaching Introduction to Chemistry, and that you put on all your promotional materials. Come study with us. You take Intro to Chemistry with a Nobel Prize winning chemist. In Australia, that same person would be shielded from ever having to deal with students. And a lot of that comes down to the rankings. So if I get back to the book, Australia's universities, can they reform? Spoiler alert, the answer is no. But one of the focus of the book is on incentives. So the international ranking systems that Australian universities pursue are almost entirely based on research. That's different from the U.S. rankings. U.S. rankings are produced by U.S. News and World Report, and they focus very heavily on student metrics, like how competitive is the entry to the program, what are the salaries of people leaving the program, what do students say about the program. There's a lot of what are the class sizes in the program. There are a lot of student-focused metrics in the rankings, and so American university presidents are very student-focused. They want to do well in the rankings. Australia has all the data to do that sort of ranking. We have the QUILT surveys, Quality Indicators in Learning and Teaching, and we have TEXA's research records, so we could combine the QUILT surveys with the TEXA research records to produce a race to the top sort of very detailed ranking. I mean, we even know in Australia how much your salary is increased between your initial salary and your 3 years later salary, depending on what university you went to. All that data is there, but the Australian government and Australian organizations have shown no interest in creating an Australia ranking that would hold universities accountable. Instead, they simply use the international rankings. And the international rankings, because teaching is incommensurate across countries, they simply use the international journal databases. And for that, worse than that, they only use journals because that's what's in the databases. They don't use books. So there's essentially no humanities and very little social sciences in the international rankings. It's all how many scientific research articles did you churn out?
Right.
And Australian universities do very well on that. We have 8 top 100 universities. All 8 of the group of 8 are top 100 on one or the other of the major rankings. And that's a sign of pathology. I mean, that 8 out of 39 universities, 20% of Australia's universities in the top 100 is unparalleled around the world. I mean, no other country has 20% of its universities being in the global top 100. It sounds like an accomplishment here, but in reality, it's a sign that Australian universities have perverted their political economy. They've taken all of this very generous support they receive from the Australian Commonwealth and turned it around into pursuing big science research projects conducted by people who don't actually teach Australian students.
So I don't want to skip to the end because we've got a lot to cover, but I'm fascinated to know, Salvatore, what you just said about the rankings is plain and I could imagine quite shocking. Now, if you have you had the chance to put that forward to an administrator one-on-one when no one else is around, and that like someone that won't just immediately blow you off? And were they receptive at all? Did they at least acknowledge what you had said?
They don't acknowledge it because to acknowledge it would be to lose face, and it's create. I mean, as an administrator, you have to be very careful about what you say, even in private. They're aware of it. Let me put it that way. Now, some are aware of it and embrace it, that, well, why wouldn't we want to be excellent? I think the majority viewpoint, both among administrators and among business people and government officials I've talked to, and journalists, is, well, what's wrong with being excellent? Of course we want to be excellent. And when you talk to them, okay, at least insider academics are aware that pursuit of research excellence in isolation may not be good for the university, but I think they also feel that they're trapped in this system that rewards that. If they didn't do it, they would be on the way out, right? Their job is, when you have a metric, you try to hit it. What gets measured gets done, in the old management aphorism. And right now, what gets measured is international university rankings. And this has all happened since 2002. There were no international university rankings before 2002. Reorganizing universities and reorganizing an entire university system to game the rankings is really something that's happened in the last 15 years. It's not It's not an age-old practice.
What's interesting, what you're saying there about how generous the Australian government is in terms of helping to fund universities, but all I ever hear is that Australian universities are underfunded. Like,
Yeah,
what
well,
does
that's the narrative.
underfunding
Yeah.
actually mean?
Well, first of all, in public economics, there's no such thing as underfunding a public service. You simply fund it better or worse. If you fund your roads department better, you can have beautiful, clean, perfectly paved highways all the time. And if you fund it worse, you'll have a few cracks. And if you fund it even worse, you'll have some potholes. You can have better or worse services. Australia's funding for universities is above the OECD average, above the European Union average, above the US average, and the UK average. So, on a comparative basis, Australia is funding its universities reasonably well. Could we take more money? Of course we could. And I think the problem here is that the narrative on university funding is driven by three kinds of organizations. It's driven by universities. It's driven by their trade associations, Group of 8 Universities Australia, and it's driven by the unions, the National Tertiary Education Union. Well, all three of these have a common interest in seeing more university funding, right? Of course, we all want more money. That doesn't mean that they're underfunded. It just means that someone should be pushing back with real data about funding levels.
Yes, well, it's just staggering because the again, old-fashioned crying poor is what we heard in the newspaper. Like it's sort of like, with no, it's this, we need, like during the pandemic, we need an injection or the whole thing will pack up, and with no supporting evidence, or really no case. They didn't make a case as to why they shouldn't fold. Do you know what I mean? Like I didn't hear a lot of, the reason you need us is because of A, B, and C.
The argument during the pandemic was the Australian government has to give more money in order to help universities maintain Australia's research infrastructure, is how they put it. They got an
Creepy
extra
language.
$1 billion on top of the existing research block grants. That came despite the fact that in retrospect, we now know that universities hardly lost anything as a group. University of Sydney actually had more money coming in from international students. Almost all of the losses that universities experienced during the pandemic were investment losses, and those will presumably be made up as investments rebound to pre-pandemic levels. What's more, on top of that, the universities had long said, in response to criticisms of their international student intakes, and I hope we do get to international students, that they'd long said that, well, it's all variable revenue attached to variable costs. If the international student flows dry up, we can just stop funding these initiatives. Reasonably enough, why not? The phrase was, why not make hay while the sun shines? But then when rain came, they said, well, we can't scale back these efforts. We need a government to fill the gap. It's like, well, which way do you want it? The fact is it's the Australian government standing by and backstopping everything.
Well, let's talk about international students. Maybe to start basic, what proportion of the intake is from overseas, and how does that stack up with universities from overseas?
Australia has an extraordinary number of international students. Australian universities were already among the most internationalized in the world 20 years ago. In the ensuing 20 years, Australian universities have gone off the charts. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate. Roughly one third of our students are overseas students. And that doesn't even include New Zealand students or Australian children of Australian permanent residents. They count as domestic students. So the true number of international students is even larger. There's no university system in the world other than Australia's that is so extraordinarily, I don't want to say reliant, because I think we can make a big argument, and I make an argument in the book, that we're actually losing money on international students, but that has such a high concentration of international students. And the reason behind it is simple. The Australian government is paying for the basic infrastructure of the universities, and international students represent pure free cash flow from the university standpoint. Just tack on a few extra tutors, and the rest of the international student tuition is yours to do what you want with, because the classroom's been paid for by the Commonwealth, the teacher's salary has been paid for by the Commonwealth. The research that the teacher's doing has been paid for by the Commonwealth. Libraries have been paid for by the Commonwealth. The laboratories have been paid for by the Commonwealth. And this model this funding model is why Australian universities have been incentivized to go to extraordinary lengths to recruit international students in a way that you just don't see anywhere else. I mean, the average Australian university is roughly 20% international students. The most international public university in the entire United States is 19% international. It's just extraordinary. I mean, places in Australia that no one outside the country's ever heard of have more international students than University of UC San Diego has 19% international, the most in the U.S. It's just extraordinary, and it's driven by the financing. International students give vice chancellors a free cash flow to spend how they like. It's purely at their discretion. Whereas Australian students, of course, their tuition revenue has to be used to pay for the fixed costs of running the university.
Well, there is this perception out there that these students are charged a premium to come down under here and study. And yeah, as you say, these fees are used at the Chancellor's discretion, but presumably they're there to help make the services and the facilities at the university better. But you say that's not quite the case.
No, they're being undercharged. They're being offered a discount. And the reason is that when Deloitte Access Economics estimated for the government the cost of education, they only put into their estimates the cost of hiring the teachers, as if the classrooms just exist. The IT systems just exist, right? So compared to what the Australian government is paying to educate, quote unquote, an Australian student, yes, international student tuitions are very high. Compared to what the Australian government spends sum total for the purpose of maintaining universities for Australian students, international student tuition is low. Which is to say that if you assume that the entire reason the Australian government supports universities is to educate students, that the Australian government has no particular interest in having a new book written about Jane Austen. Right? The only reason they're funding this book to be written about Jane Austen is so that someone will be teaching English. Like, that's why you fund the book. It's just incredible. If you put all of the cost of running the university, I mean, the whole reason the federal government is spending on a library is to educate students. It's not just like a budget item. Oh, we need 39 university libraries in Australia. It's there to educate students. If you put all of these costs in and lump them together as the cost of educating Australian students, international students are not paying a proportionate share of that. That is, international students are not paying enough to cover their usage of the library, to cover their usage of laboratories, even to cover their lecturers. They're only paying enough to cover their tutors, the marginal costs, and then everything else is free cash flow for the universities.
Well, when you explain this in your book, I thought of it reminded me of what they say in Goodfellas when they own that bar. They say you take the alcohol in the front and then you take it out the back and sell it at half the price. It doesn't matter. It's all profit. So this is what I thought about with the international student situation. They're being creative with it's all cream, so we can charge them half and get more in.
I think you're absolutely right that there is an implicit discount on international students. Now, it may not be 50%, it may not be half, but it's there. It's there, and it's hard to calculate the exact number, but we know it's there because we can see it in all of the circumstantial evidence. Australia has the most international students in the world. Why is it such an attractive destination? Not because of our great universities. Even our poor universities attract tons of international students. It's because we are underpriced. You also see that when you compare the value of the Australian dollar to our international student inflows. When the Australian dollar is high, when it was riding up in 2011, 2012 at parity with the US dollar, our international student intake plummeted because we were suddenly an expensive degree or a fully priced degree. With the Australian dollar at 70 cents to the US dollar, we're attractive. It's all a price game. And the only other country that's competitive with Australia on price is the United Kingdom. And the reason the United Kingdom is competitive with Australia on price is they have pretty much the same funding system that we do. And so UK universities are now, to use the British expression, hoovering up international students, because previously they had to accept EU students on the same basis as domestic students. Now EU students are foreign students, and great, they can bring in the world's international students on the same model that Australian universities have done, which is the UK government pays for the university, and international student revenue is just free cash flow for UK universities.
Well, you mentioned earlier that teaching standards in Australian universities are pretty poor. Do the international students know this? Do they know what kind of an education they're going to be getting?
There are massive complaints from international students about the poor quality of teaching in Australia. The biggest one focuses on them complaining that there are too many international students. So we have entire programs in business and, ironically, in journalism that are more than 85% international students. And the problem, of course, is that if you're, the typical international student in Australia is Chinese. If you're from the People's Republic of China, you come to an English-speaking country in hopes of improving your English language skills, but everyone in your class is also from China. And so you conduct all of your work in Chinese, and Chinese students have told me that they even do their group work in Chinese and then appoint someone to translate it into English as the final step. And this is not something that they love. This is something they realize is a problem. They came to Australia to meet Australians and learn English, and they're simply not learning the language because they're not embedded in an English-speaking milieu. There are also complaints from international students about not being able to understand the lecturers, being in classes that are too large. There's a lot of complaints about doing online education for the same price, because the point is they're not here for the literal education. They're here for the experience of meeting people from another country, from learning English, studying in a new place. And, doing an online tutorial in Chinese from China is really not the international student experience they were hoping for.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say all of that. That was my next question. I just my experience going back to Monash just a few years ago was that the overwhelming presence of the Chinese population there was comical, to the point of that they're only notionally studying abroad, and I just thought from their perspective, as you say, that that it wasn't very fruitful. They might, because they weren't intermingling. There was a ghetto-like separation of the student body. There was no interaction at all between it's a numbers thing. So, like, you think about it rationally, you go, well, if I was going to study abroad, I'd want to go to Italy, and I'd want to be kind of like the only Australian, and then I'd want to just drop myself in and really immerse. And they didn't get any of that. And there's obviously a perverse incentive being offered by to the administrators and they're obviously not telling them on the other end, whoever is setting them up. And I have a friend who works in setting students up with matchmaking them with universities, and I think he probably is part of the problem. In this way.
Right. Well, look, word of mouth gets around, and I'm sure that most Chinese applicants are now aware of the extraordinary concentrations of Chinese students at Australian universities. They probably were much less aware 10 years ago. There's still advantages in coming to Australia, but I have to say I talk to a lot of Chinese students. I mean, I'm involved a lot in China studies. I don't speak Chinese, but I do socialize a lot in the Chinese student community. And I've never heard any Chinese student in Australia say a good thing about an Australian university. I think there's a very high level of dissatisfaction with the education they're getting, but it is an opportunity to get out of China, right? And so even if they're dissatisfied with the university, it might be worth the price for a upper middle class Chinese family to, get their child out, breathe fresh air. I mean, the best experience Chinese students have of Australia is often they can see a blue sky, which, for someone, if you grow up in Shanghai and you never see a blue sky your entire life, that's something worth paying for. But it's certainly not the education. I've not heard a single of the dozens of Chinese students I've had frank discussions with. I've never heard one say that she or he was very satisfied with the education received here.
They must also like their social credit system being put on pause for a few months.
Yeah, it's a bit of freedom. Many enjoy living in Australia. I even have a Chinese student, former student of mine, who started his own adventure tourism company, taking other Chinese people to exotic locations in the Australian outback and such, and getting in the great outdoors, things you can't do in China. But it's not for our sterling education.
Well, let's pivot to something that's on everybody's lips, and that's this notion of wokeness. What effect has wokeness had on the university system? Is it as bad as we think it is?
No, it is not as bad as people say. Universities are, of course, very woke places, but that's more the academics and the students. I routinely bring up very controversial topics in class. I always present multiple sides of topics. I always hide from students what view I may have other than a broadly humane, liberal approach. I'm always very accepting of multiple approaches. And students don't seem to be, and I teach sociology, and my students don't seem to be particularly extreme. It's my colleagues who are extreme. And they simply take for granted that their view of the world is self-evidently the correct view of the world. So the real problem for wokeness isn't that someone who is unwoke will be hounded out of a job. I think that's very rare. It's happened, but it's very rare. The real problem is that hiring committees will always hire people like them. So if you have a very what the rest of society would consider a very extreme, cutting edge viewpoint on social issues, well, for your hiring committee, that's absolutely an ordinary position on social issues. Whereas if you are just a ordinary conservative in line with 40% of the Australian population, you'll be considered an extremist, maybe labeled a fascist, certainly not someone who they would want as a colleague. And I think that's the real problem. It's self-selection among academics reinforces a single groupthink. There's a lack of what Jonathan Haidt has called, very aptly, viewpoint diversity. That's the real problem.
Yes. Well, we're mindful of time, but we would like to pivot just with a couple of questions about another book you've written. While we've got you,
Yeah.
You wrote a book early in the Trump presidency about populism and authoritarianism. We covered this at the beginning briefly. Perhaps you could give us just your definition of populism and whether Donald Trump was a populist or not.
The New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts is the book. Trump is clearly a populist, but I don't use that as an insult. I think populism is a very refreshing, it is a way of refreshing a political system that has become ossified. Now, what Donald Trump certainly isn't is authoritarian. And the reason I wrote the book, The New Authoritarianism, was I heard the American political establishment routinely calling Donald Trump authoritarian. And I said, as someone who studied authoritarianism, you can't be an authoritarian if the only authority you accept is yourself. And Donald Trump may be egotistical, but he's certainly not an authoritarian. An authoritarian is someone who governs with the authority of the leading institutions in society. For the classic authoritarianisms of Southern Europe, that meant the church and the security services. Or for the current authoritarianisms of, say, Iran and Turkey, it's the mosque and the security service. Or for Vladimir Putin's authoritarianism, it's the Orthodox Church and the security services. The institutions of society fully supporting a ruler against the broader democratic will of a country. That's authoritarianism. Donald Trump is absolutely not authoritarian. He was absolutely vilified by the main authorities in society. Populism in general is an anti-authoritarian movement. Now, because we all accept that authoritarianism is bad, the establishment has not just recently, but for the last 50 years, last 80 years, attempted to link populism with authoritarianism. But there's nothing. I mean, everyone likes to go back to Adolf Hitler in Weimar Germany, but Hitler's Nazi movement was anything but a populist movement. I mean, his Nazi movement was a very strict, top-down, disciplined movement, not a spontaneous outburst of support from the people. I mean, Hitler never even won 50% of the vote in Germany, so it's hard to call him a populist. But people routinely, want to associate, not people, establishment intellectuals routinely want to associate these. But it's just trying to associate something you don't like with something else you don't like. There's no theoretical reality behind it. Populism rarely has a political position. Populism instead is a broad movement of anger with existing politics. I mean, Donald Trump at times on the campaign actually advocated a $15 minimum wage. He advocated all sorts of policies that, where people just were angry with the existing institutions. They weren't necessarily pro-Trump. And I think that stands today. There's no particular set of policies that you can identify as Trumpism. He's simply an anti-establishment candidate and remains that and will be that if he runs in 2024.
Well, I'd love to get your take on the Biden presidency. Is this the unity and the business as usual that people wanted? Has he delivered that?
It's the business as usual that people didn't want. So he has delivered business as usual, consensus establishment rule in the United States, with members of the political establishment doing deals behind the scenes to stitch up, to use the Australian word, to stitch up things how they like it and present it to the people as a fait accompli. I don't think that's what people want. I think the Biden administration is likely to be wiped out in the midterm elections in 2022, but in the presidential elections in 2024. Now that people see what business as usual really means, I think they're very aware that it's not what they want. People may not be sure what they do want, but I think they're sure that business as usual is not it.
There seems to be a view amongst the Democrats and their surrogates in the media and the Hollywood and everywhere else that there's only one legitimate party, one legitimate point of view on every issue. So much so that if you stray from these norms, you're censored, doxxed, shadow banned, tarred, whatever. So if the views of the Democratic Party and their like are indeed intrinsically legitimate and watertight, why are they so concerned about counter-arguments and dissent?
Well, that is the new authoritarianism of my book's title. It's a new form of liberal authoritarian. It's America's liberal establishment, in alliance with the liberal establishment in other countries, trying to monopolize the political space to present an establishment view as a consensus view, when in reality there is no consensus. And as long as we have democracy, of course, every 2 years, or depending on Australia, every 3 years, we'll have a check on that. We have the people getting to weigh in and say, are you doing things right? I mean, to my mind, democracy is not so much about representation as it is about the ability to fire your representatives. And in America, that ability is alive and well. We're going to see a bloodbath at the 2022 midterm elections because people are unhappy with the way they've been represented.
We have a final question for you. We ask all our guests this, and we'd like to know what you're reading right now.
As an academic, reading is my job. So I'm always reading lots of things, and I don't always like them. So I can't give you I'm not going to give you a book recommendation, but it's just what we do. I would encourage people just to be reading all the time, and audiobooking. When you're not reading, just put on the headphones and audiobook. It's a great thing to do.
Well, what I will do is encourage people to read your books, Salvatore.
Thank you, very kind.
Including Australia's Universities, Can They Reform, and the second book we mentioned, the New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts, which I have read. Where can people find you online, Salvatore? Where can they find your work?
Oh, just Google Salvatore Babones. Or read Quadrant. I write a monthly humor column for Quadrant called The Philistine. And I'm very proud of it, getting a chance to try my hand at humor a bit and poke fun at everything. I really enjoy it.
That's great. And you're back on Twitter, so...
Well, only at a reduced capacity until the deal goes through.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to encourage Elon to go for it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Thank you for having me.